Descended from centuries-old bandit gangs and spawned by the Vietnam War, this new breed of criminal is young, tough, and fearless, dispassionately dealing violence to their own people with extreme prejudice. They are into drugs, forgery, and extorting computer technology. A creeping new force vying for world organized crime domination. The Vietnamese crime gangs.
For much of the 20th century, the American Mafia proved to be one of the most successful and profitable models for large-scale organized crime. But times have changed, and the fortunes of the mob have waned, leaving a power vacuum that has been filled by new players. This new breed is perhaps best exemplified by Vietnamese crime gangs, which had their genesis in the turmoil of war-torn Southeast Asia.
These indelible images of the fall of Saigon mark the end of one calamity and the beginning of another. A mass outpouring of people from a war-ravaged and war-weary Vietnam. More than 160,000 Vietnamese, many of them orphaned or abandoned children, were resettled in America. Tens of thousands more fled Vietnam trying to find refuge in other parts of Asia and even Australia. Along with the desperate and the displaced went the seed that eventually spawned the crime gangs, now evident in major American cities and in other parts of the world.
It should have come as no surprise that the street urchins and orphans of Saigon so readily turned to a life of crime in their new homeland. The concept of organized crime was not new to their native culture. Stretching back more than 1,000 years was a history of banditry along the length and breadth of the Mekong Delta.
Historians say Vietnamese bandit gangs, some of them descendants of Indonesian pirates as far back as 750 AD, were looting on the high seas, extorting protection money from river traders, terrorizing local villagers, and preying on wealthy Chinese merchants. By the time the French colonized Indochina in the 1860s, organized crime had become an entrenched part of Vietnamese society. In July 1941, Japan moved 50,000 troops into Indochina, virtually neutralizing French rule. In a quite extraordinary piece of maneuvering, a one-time street hoodlum named Bai Vien managed to convince Japanese authorities to appoint him chief of police in Saigon. Bai Vien and his criminal cohorts controlled drug running, gambling rackets, and prostitution for more than a decade. Indeed, the bears had been put in charge of the honey. But there was nothing sweet about life for the human tidal wave of Vietnamese forced to flee their homeland at the end of the Vietnam War. Tens of thousands of refugees were crammed into overcrowded camps in Southeast Asia. The lucky ones were resettled in faraway America, Canada, France, and Australia. But even in America, hopes of a good life for many Indo-Chinese immigrants were dashed on the rocks of economic recession which had gripped the United States.
Desperate and disaffected, they turned to crime. It wasn't long before individuals banded together and devised new schemes. Like other ethnic gangs before them, the Vietnamese turned first on their own people, using terror tactics to force victims into submission and ensure they didn't go to the authorities.
The concept of the home invasion robbery was actually a concept that was developed by Vietnamese immigrant kids in Southern California that were led by some very sophisticated young gang members And they developed it, they refined it, and then it was eventually taught to other kids coming into the Southern California area from across the nation. And subsequently, my understanding now is it's even spread outside the borders of the United States, where the home invasion robbery is now occurring in places like Asia, Canada, and regions of the world like that.
The first thing they do when they burst into a home, if the head of the family, the male person, is present, they shoot that person in the leg.
Rape has also been used to intimidate families into handing over cash and jewels or paying up on extortion demands. Sometimes the victims of these vicious sexual attacks were just 10 years old.
Another technique they use, if a very small child, preferably a baby, is present, they take the baby.
No! No! No!
And they tape it to the wall using electrical duct tape. They then take their weapon and they fire shots around the wall. A bit like a Bugs Bunny cartoon, a little bit more dangerous.
This propensity for violence and an apparent willingness to use it on their own ethnic community is what sets Vietnamese apart from other crime gangs.
Well, the home invasion robbery, of course, tended always to be a very vicious and violent crime. We've had some horrific acts of torture that have occurred upon family members in which the victims have not been forthcoming or with valuables or are being hidden in the house and things of that nature. Not specific to Westminster, but over time I've assisted a lot of other agencies in the investigation of some of their Vietnamese gang crimes. We've had home invasion robberies where the baby was picked up by the ankle and its head was repeatedly dunked in the toilet because the mother was not telling the suspects where the jewelry in the house was being hidden. We've had water that was cooked on the stove and poured over the 79-year-old grandmother because the father was not telling the gang members quickly enough where the money in the house is being hidden.
Asian crime gang experts have learned that the gangs function with a complexity that is not immediately obvious.
Most of the Vietnamese street gangs today are fully capable of working on two separate, distinct levels. The first is in crimes for economic gain. In crimes where the ultimate goal is money, you will find that all wars will be put to one side and all alliances will be put to one side. And in an effort to do a particularly big crime where there's a lot of money involved, it is not at all uncommon to find members of rival gangs joining together to commit this crime, splitting the money, and then going back to the respective street gangs. The second level that the Vietnamese gangs operate on is for the benefit of the gang's reputation or the gang's face. Everything you do is done with an eye towards enhancing the reputation, the power, the character, the strength of the gang. You know, its reputation for violence, its reputation for sophistication. All of those things are done with a view towards the more face your gang has in the gang subculture, the more face you will have because you belong to that.
Vietnamese or Viet Chinh gangs, as they call themselves, now exist in most reasonable-sized American cities.
17 Foxtrot.
17 Foxtrot.
10-8 from 9200 Bolsa en route to 9191 Bolsa.
Difficulty.
Law enforcement agencies agree that Viet Chinh gangs are already a significant problem in 16 states. One of the highest profile Vietnamese gangs on America's west coast is the Toma Boys, who came to public prominence in the very early 1990s. In a 4-month period, the gang netted more than $1 million in stolen property, from car break-ins, robberies, and auto thefts throughout Southern California. The gang had more than 150 members operating in Orange, Los Angeles, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties. The Natoma Boys were the first Vietnamese gang to pattern themselves on Occidental gangs, adopting gang colors, gang signs, and gang monikers. In the mid-1990s, the gang came under concentrated attention from law enforcement agencies, and many of the gang members ended up in jail. Today, there's increasing evidence that some of the larger gangs have become more sophisticated and have evolved hierarchy structures like those the Mafia developed as it gained a real foothold in America. California's Justice Department estimates that that state alone now has at least 15,000 members in Asian street gangs. The city of Westminster in Orange County, Southern California, has one of the largest concentrations in America of ethnic Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians. The influence of Vietnamese culture in the city is such that it is often called Little Saigon. Views between gang wars are nothing new. With Asian gangs, though, there's often another dimension beyond the traditional turf war. It's a complex question of face, or more to the point, loss of face. This loss of face, rather than a dispute over territory, is often the cause of big trouble in Little Saigon.
Prior to Tet, which is our Vietnamese New Year's festival, we had a shooting in a cafe in which one of our Nip family street gang members was killed by a rival gang because of some looks that were exchanged while the members were at the festival next door. And because of this dirty look, they felt they lost face, and they went in to try and take care of the problem.
Sometimes the violence spills onto the streets, providing a stark reminder that organized crime, although often unseen, does still exist.
It appears that we've got a large Asian gang war in progress.
This young man was attacked with machetes and swords after an argument with a carload of other Vietnamese youths in a quiet suburban street in Australia. Eyewitnesses watch in utter disbelief as the victim was hacked about the head, the arms, the back, and the abdomen.
Yeah, mate, about 5 of them jumped out of this car and hacking into this poor bloke. And they had these big knives and choppers and swords. Oh, they had everything.
Although badly injured, fortunately for this young man, he did recover after extensive surgery. But he will carry the scars for the rest of his life. Not everyone who crosses swords with a Vietnamese crime gang, however, gets off so lightly. A crusading politician named John Newman from Sydney, Australia, decided to confront local crime gangs head-on. He publicly railed against them on television and at local meetings in the Vietnamese enclave of Cabramatta. He demanded the gangs and those bankrolling them quit pushing heroin in his neighborhood.
There's a deal going down the ramp, the downward ramp on the eastern side now.
You just handed him the money. Go 4 units, let's see the answer.
Yeah, mate, he's heading south. Repeat, heading south.
All right, just send him back. You two stay in the field, you copy?
Yeah, copy. I'll keep the gear with me then.
John Newman wanted the epidemic that had become all too obvious on the streets brought under control.
How much? 40. 40? How much? 45. 45? Yeah. Can you get me more?
On this occasion, two dealers fought over the sale.
You got money here?
Yeah.
How much indeed?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. How much can you do me for 10?
130, 270.
270?
Yeah. 240.
So open was a trade in heroin that a local television station captured this remarkable image of a couple who had overdosed.
Just relax, just relax. Just open your eyes for me, darling. Open your eyes. You know what happened? You know what happened? Yeah. You overdosed on heroin, okay?
Yeah.
You weren't breathing, okay? You weren't breathing, your mate's still not breathing. I got to help him, alright? Do me a favour. Do me a favour and just sit there and relax, okay? Just sit there and relax.
Okay?
Yeah, you're going to be falling. If we stop treating you, you're going... Alright, you're going to go under the heroin again, okay? Yeah, okay.
Newman's one-man campaign brought little reaction from the authorities, but it struck a raw nerve with the drug dealers. And it wasn't long before the death threats began.
You're dead, Newman. What can do? You're dead, Newman.
Matters got worse. Newman's office was shot up, and his car fired upon. In something of an understatement, Newman put his situation this way.
I've attracted the wrath of this gang.
Indeed he had. Within 2 weeks, John Newman was dead, gunned down outside his home after he spoke at a public meeting on drug crime. He was shot at close range before the eyes of his fiancée, Lucy Wang. Months later, 2 ethnic Vietnamese were arrested and charged with Newman's murder. His untimely death prompted public outrage and finally action from law enforcement agencies who set up a special task force. It also prompted a very public display of support for John Newman and his fight against organized crime from the local Vietnamese community. In the United States, importation and distribution of heroin has long been a jealously protected preserve of Chinese crime gangs called triads. Despite many common links between the triads and the Viet Chinh gangs, the Chinese have no intention of letting anyone else control the heroin trade. The Vietnamese have thus been forced to find some other niche in the drug market.
Heroin trafficking in the western half of the United States has traditionally always been controlled by Chinese organized crime syndicates. Again, the Chinese were established here far earlier than the Vietnamese refugee influx. I mean, from when the railroads were built in the late 1800s, initially in San Francisco and then subsequently in Los Angeles. And you're talking about a significant Chinese organized crime influence that existed in the Los Angeles area in the 1960s already. And so they immediately sewed up the heroin trafficking operations. And as a result, the Vietnamese kids getting into organized crime and getting into street gangs lacked a source of supply for the heroin because it was controlled by the Chinese syndicates. Now, the Chinese syndicates would subcontract out with the Vietnamese level gangs to distribute the product on the street, but they didn't feel comfortable with that. There's a lot of traditional animosity between the two cultures and the two populations. They didn't really feel they trust them. We, in fact, have now a far greater problem, that is in the distribution of methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, which has taken off tremendously here in California, is relatively easy to make. You can make it at home using certain chemicals. It is not something that needs to be imported from outside the country. And the Vietnamese kids have picked up on that very quickly, and we now have fairly extensive methamphetamine trafficking organizations involving Vietnamese.
But across the Pacific in Australia, where there are also Vietnamese gangs, heroin trafficking has become their stock and trade, and they work hand in hand with Chinese gangs. Operations head of Australia's National Crime Authority, Peter Lam, however, sees street gangs expanding their power.
They've always been at the bottom end of the chain, but they are now starting to appear as multi-kilo distributors, which is 1 or 2 levels up from the street. And there is some evidence also to indicate that they are becoming involved in importations themselves, arranging the importation, facilitating it, and then being the recipient of the product. Yes, there is evidence of that occurring. They are starting to play a more prominent role in narcotics distribution. And from time to time we do see them involved in importations, but they have individuals, specific individuals have, I suppose, graduated out of that street crime type activity into a more organised environment and become entrepreneurs in their own right. Little wonder there is a nexus between Vietnamese gangs and the lucrative drug market.
The young bandit gangs of Indo-Chinese refugees who came to America and other parts of the West in the 1980s were driven by one thing and one thing only: money. Most saw a direct link between amassing personal wealth and being acceptable in Western society. And for them, crime seemed the quickest route to riches.
These kids figured out very, very quickly it is more efficient to do crime in a group than it is to do crime individually. You make much more money getting 4 or 5 friends together and doing let's say, a home invasion robbery than you do shoplifting at the local department store by yourself. The monetary take on an organized operation like a home invasion in which you bring in 4 or 5 other individuals is much greater than trying to operate by yourself out there in a criminal element. And so what these kids initially ended up doing is they would approach friends they had in the refugee camps or friends they were going to school with and would get them to cooperate with them in committing the criminal activity. It was these kind of individual groups of kids that really were not yet organized or structured in any type or manner that we gave the name bandit groups to, because they literally operated as almost gypsy bands. They went out, they would get together to commit criminal activity for economic gain, and then would go back to their respective homes or their schools or whatever and hang out until it came time to commit another crime for economic gain.
While profit almost certainly was a driving force for the gangs of Vietnamese refugees, it may not be the full explanation.
The attraction to gangs for many kids, for most kids, has to do with their own needs for identity, for status, for prestige, for something to belong to. They don't join by and large in order to do crime. Crime comes along with it and is exaggerated by gang membership. But for the most part, kids join gangs to get these other needs fulfilled. Sometimes they join them for a sense of protection. They think that they will be protected against other groups, rival groups, if they join Gang X. What they don't recognize, of course, is that makes them more vulnerable to attack by Gang X.
Whatever the original sociological reasons for the formation of Vietnamese gangs, today the lure of big money from sophisticated crime is what drives the better organized ones.
In 1997, working in conjunction with the Denver Police Department in the state of Colorado, we received information on a large-scale check counterfeiting operation that existed in the United States. There was several individuals that were arrested in Denver who subsequently said that the brains, that the leaders of the organization were in fact all Orange Boy members who were established in California. In doing a series of operations, we eventually were able to take down a counterfeiting factory here in the Orange County area, in which an individual who was an Orange Boy gang member using a computer was producing counterfeit payroll checks. These counterfeit payroll checks were for banks that were not in the state of California. And he would produce them in batches of 50 to 100. These checks were then sent out of state along with an Orange Boy member. They would go to the state where the checks, where the banks existed that the checks were counterfeited from. And this Orange Boy member would then recruit from the local Asian communities people who would pass these checks to the banks.
The Orange Boys pulled the counterfeit check swindle in 16 states across America. 40% of the take went directly back to them. The rest was split up among teams of Vietnamese hired to pass the checks. And the cost to the banks, millions of dollars. The story of the Orange Boys counterfeit racket has a footnote that is almost as remarkable as the story itself. Sergeant Marcus Frank tells us about Phong Vu Nguyen, a drug addict who took over control of the Orange Boys gang.
The leadership of the gang changed after the original leader was killed during a pursuit by police while driving a stolen car, and his brother took over leadership of the gang. His brother at the time was a hardcore heroin addict. He was doing approximately $200 to $300 worth of heroin a day, but a very intelligent individual. And at the time he took over the gang, took himself off heroin himself, cold turkey, so to speak, and immediately sat down and instructed his gang members that they needed to present a lower profile to the police. that he did not want them out there on the street committing street gang activities. He didn't want them being contacted by the police. He didn't want them admitting their gang affiliation. And what he was able to do was he was able to decrease the activity of Orange Boys to the point where for 3 years there was no police record of any Orange Boy activity occurring. About the same time that this happened, we had a homicide of a California state police officer who was killed on a traffic stop by a Vietnamese individual by the name of Hung Mai. Hung Mai was part of the Orange Boy organization. As a matter of fact, he reported to the leader of the Orange Boys, and the reason that police officer was killed was because Hung Mai had counterfeiting equipment for checks in the trunk of his car. And the car was going to be towed away, and this individual felt that because it was his third strike, he was going to go to jail or prison a long time, and he ended up basically executing the officer. The officer didn't have much of a chance.
Phong Vu Nguyen, who ran the old Orange Boys, is now serving 8 years behind bars for the counterfeit checks racket. He is something of a rarity among Vietnamese gangs. Many other organized crime gangs depend upon structure. There's a centuries-old customs that form the Chinese triad, the Japanese yakuza, the classic power structure of the traditional mafia. But the Vietnamese use a system where leaders are appointed temporarily depending on their suitability for the task at hand.
Have it done 6.
Yeah. 6, alright, okay. You're gonna take the night. I know where there's 6, maybe 7.
It is a structure that makes it more difficult for law enforcement agencies to pinpoint who is in a gang. And it means a gang will survive even if the head of one crime enterprise is cut off.
Most of the Vietnamese street gangs do not have a hierarchical structure. Although they may have a dominant personality figure that for the most part runs the gang or advises the gang, oftentimes leadership of the gang may devolve upon the person who has the most experience committing that type of crime. So for example, a Vietnamese gang that is planning to do a residential home invasion robbery, they may have a 14-year-old member that's done 6 of these already. And for that night, the leadership of that gang will devolve upon this 14-year-old for the purpose of that home invasion. 2 nights later, perhaps the gang decides they're going to steal a car, and now the leadership of the gang may go over to the 16-year-old member of the gang that has the most experience in stealing cars. So experience plays a very great role in terms of determining who leads the gang for a particular effort.
If understanding the power structures within Vietnamese gangs is puzzling, then accurately defining where on the ladder of organized crime these gangs stand is equally difficult. The experts all have differing opinions. Even among law enforcement officers, views can be poles apart.
Operations head of the National Crime Authority in Australia, Peter Lamb.
If you'd have asked me that question probably 3 or 4 years ago, I would have answered by saying they don't. Whilst they're been largely involved in street crime type activity up till maybe 3 or 4 years ago, they are starting to play a more prominent role in narcotics distribution. And from time to time we do see them involved in importations. But they have individuals, specific individuals have, I suppose, graduated out of that street crime type activity into a more organised environment and become entrepreneurs in their own right.
Chief of Police for Westminster City in California, James Cook.
In my 37 years of experience, they transition faster from street gangs to organized criminal activity. There's an FBI definition that we tend to use also of ACEs, Asian Criminal Enterprises, and the Vietnamese are extremely good at organizing ACEs. These are ad hoc groups that come together to work on 1 or 2 for-profit crime ventures, and then they may disband and go on and do something else. And street gangs feed into these Asian criminal enterprises, but by the same token, people that run these Asian criminal enterprises are like business managers in the corporate world, and they put together the enterprise and go ahead and do it that way.
I think if you look at the news reports, they always overemphasize the level of organization in street gangs, so that if you see a pattern of crime, whether it's Vietnamese home invasions or Chinese extortions or what have you, you get the feeling that that's what those gangs are all about. That's a distortion of reality. That's a piece of what they're doing, and that piece may require some level of organization by some members of the gang. But there are many other members of the gang that are not doing that are doing various other kinds of things, as any other gang will. And so if you get a whole picture of what that gang is up to, you don't get a very good picture of true organization. These kids are not mafia, they're not Cosa Nostra, and it's foolish to apply to them the kinds of techniques that we would apply to adult criminal gangs.
Overall, the Vietnamese street gangs prefer the firearm. It is the one weapon that makes them equal on the street with any other gang that they may encounter, that makes them, in their eyes, all-powerful. Many of these kids realized early on that they were, for the most part, of smaller stature than your typical Occidental street gang member or your typical Occidental victim. They're smaller in size and oftentimes in weight, so the one factor that equals everything up is the firearm. For the most part, they prefer the semi-automatic or the fully automatic handgun. It's easily concealable, and it's also preferred because of the manner in which they shoot their weapons. Very few of these gang members take a sight picture over gun sights. Instead, they do what we call spray and pray. They crank out as many rounds from the weapon in as short amount of time as possible. With the intention that their target goes down in that field of fire. A number of years ago, we had several instances where individuals went into a restaurant with an automatic weapon and opened fire. And the casualty count was 2 dead and 8 wounded, or 1 dead and 13 wounded. And investigating that particular crime, it turned out there was only one individual in that whole restaurant that the gangs were targeting. Everyone else was simply hit in this field of fire that was put down by the gang members when they went into the front door of the restaurant.
Initially, law enforcement tackled gang crime on a local basis, but instead of crime gangs diminishing, the opposite happened. Law enforcement had to devise new ways to deal with a new type of criminal.
So what this really does is to confront this enclave, which would require a huge police department. We now have brought in the resources of different levels of government and specifically aimed them at the Vietnamese organized crime problem. And we are able to respond with lightning-like ability, and we move through an antiquated criminal justice system in a matter of moments, because when Sergeant Frank calls up there and he talks to the United States Attorney who's handling the latest money laundering case, they're very familiar with that. We've already, by a whole series of relationships, established a team, and they operate as a team. It's the way the Japanese built cars to make them go better. It's the way we put people on the moon. A team works on a problem. In this case, the Asian Organized Crime Team, we call it SIU, Special Investigations Unit, are set and ready to go. They have access to county prosecutors, they have access to federal prosecutors, they have access to county resources, we have access to federal government resources, and we have our local resources. That multi-jurisdictional team enables us then to keep abreast of what's going on down there. Because I'll tell you quite frankly, the Asian organized crime and the Vietnamese end of it is very innovative and extremely violent.
What is happening in police circles is we are following the patterns of globalization. Crime is international. It's mushrooming on the back of globalized activities in industry and commerce and elsewhere, and therefore the police have to keep up with it. And we have regular contacts now, almost daily in some cases, where we are constantly in touch with our counterparts in other countries through Interpol, through conferences, seminars and one-to-one meetings and exchanges of staff, so that we can share experiences, not only here in Australia, but certainly from those countries where most of the immigrants have come from. Now that is tremendously important for us, because sharing of information, the exchange of ideas and the exchange of people that can help us analyse trends is very important, so it's something that we'll continue doing.
Law enforcement officers claim that in using these new integrated techniques for fighting crime, they have begun to make real progress. But Malcolm Klein thinks a sledgehammer is being used to crack a peanut.
But there are justice agencies that think in terms of conspiracy. And I think in many ways they would prefer to have street gangs, and it doesn't matter whether it's Vietnamese or Hispanic or black. They would prefer to have street gangs take on a more organized structure, A, because it makes it more of a legitimate problem to fight as law enforcement agencies, and B, because we have new or expanded techniques for dealing with organized crime that don't work very well with disorganized youth groups, street groups. We have conspiracy statutes and special sentencing structures and guidelines, RICO statutes that were developed originally for the drug trade that can be applied to criminal groups. In fact, here in California, they finally got around to defining what a street gang is. And in order to do that, the very first sentence in the definition is, a criminal street gang is. So as soon as they put crime in there, then they justified a series of responses that might not be possible without that kind of thinking.
There is often a fine line between a crime being a disorganized, spontaneous attack by a street gang and something more sinister, a deliberately planned attack that is a part of organized crime. If you are the victim, the question is academic, as this Korean tourist couple discovered in the back streets of Sydney. A security camera captured their assailants, who were determined to take every cent the hapless couple had. The woman initially refused to give up her bag, but some heavy-handed treatment soon changed her mind. For daring to resist, she was handed a second beating. And oddly, the victims began to bow in a display of respect for their attackers. Even after the police arrived, the couple refused to press charges. They actually asked the police to let the assailants go. As you have just seen, organized crime has made a return to the streets after decades behind closed doors. So what's next? As organized crime leaders of yesteryear are being replaced by brash young opportunists like the Vietnamese and other gangs, some of our experts look ahead.
I am fully convinced that the Vietnamese street gangs, along with a lot of the other Asian street gangs, as they move into organized crime, are going to far surpass any type of organized crime syndicates we've ever seen in this country. The sophistication level is simply too high, that they've already demonstrated at a very early age, and everything they do contributes to their training, contributes to their knowledge, contributes to their education, and these kids learn. Every single thing they do, every crime they commit, every gang activity they get involved in, they use as a basis of further educating themselves on how to do things better, and we've seen that happen time and time again.
Because it is an evolutionary process. Remember, the Chinese and the Japanese had to start somewhere as well. Where I place the Vietnamese today is probably where the Chinese, the raw Chinese immigrants were, say, 30 years ago, who started off at the very basic level of street extortion. Not unlike the mafia in the United States, for example, in the 40s.
I think, you know, if you're talking about the history and the future of gangs, we're in for a long-term problem. I started doing my research back in the 1960s, and the number of gang cities in this country has grown from around 50 at that point to this 3,000 or 4,000 estimate. We're reaching an asymptote, we're reaching a leveling off point, because there aren't all that many cities and towns left which have the capacity to form gangs. On the other hand, there aren't a heck of a lot of cities that are ex-gang cities. Once the phenomenon starts and gets established, it tends to perpetuate itself. And the way we respond to it tends to perpetuate it as well. So I think we've seen the worst of the increase, but I don't think we've seen much good news about a decrease in gang problem.
Those who study crime have been given a rare glimpse into the world of crime gangs when police detained this young man for questioning over a vicious attack on a Vietnamese family during a home invasion. This is part of what he told investigating officers.
We were armed with weapons and that, and we just kick the door in and just go in and do it. If you have money, then you can grab a hold of anything. It's as easy as that. With money, you can have gun, bullets, anything that you want, as long as you have money. As a teenagers who got nowhere to go, who left home and don't go to school and hang around the streets, obviously they think that to join the gang as a group, go together, they got more protection as a group.
What are we seeing here? Is it simply a random criminal act being committed by members of a Vietnamese street gang? Or is it a systematic process being perpetrated by a gang which is itself part of a bigger picture we know as organized crime? It is not a question easily answered, but it does need an answer before society at large can decide what to do.
I do believe politicians should rethink and take a second look at organized crime in America today. I would suggest, as a police chief, that maybe a presidential commission on the status of organized crime and look at the very different parts of it. Here in Westminster, we're very much exposed to Asian organized crime. But I think in the upcoming 21st century, that the federal government should host a series of conferences and perhaps have a special commission report, because organized crime has changed. From my understanding of this and the briefings that I've attended, Italian organized crime is flat and probably not increasing as rapidly as Asian crime. And so all of these things should be considered, and I think that the Justice Department should lead us on a national strategy so that all the local agencies, the state agencies, and the federal agencies can get on the same page.
You know, if you're going to look at gangs, street gangs, which is what I'm talking about, you have to be very careful not to overstate their relationships to other groups. For example, they're nothing like terrorist groups. They are really nothing like motorcycle gangs. They are really nothing like prison gangs, although there are connections between some street gangs and some prison gangs. They are really not very much like all of the youth groups that you probably are a part of, and I was a part of. We got into trouble occasionally when we were in school, in high school. But we didn't commit ourselves or orient ourselves to antisocial and criminal activity. Street gangs do. That's why we get so concerned with them. So if we're going to look at and understand them, we have to start with several things. One, they're by and large adolescent or youth groups. And that suggests, a number of things about socialization, job opportunities, training opportunities for them, and so on. Another is that group process takes over. Once kids join gangs, they get enveloped in all of this rhetoric of the gang language and the gang talk and the gang glory. And the more we do to them that emphasizes their gang as such, the more we create more cohesiveness in the gang, the more we create gang crime. So what we want to do, rather than, say, with adult gangs where we try and crack down on them as much as possible and put them away in prison as quickly as possible, with street gangs, that's going to be counterproductive, because by and large they're going to sit back and put the clippings in their pockets and say, see, man, we're so tough, they had to do this and they had to do that to us. There are lots of examples of this. And there are good data in some of the American evaluations that show that the more we do to gangs, for gangs, with gangs, the stronger they become, the more cohesive they become, and the more difficult it is to reduce that cohesiveness and the crime that results from it. So, from my point of view, one has to be extremely strategic and sensitive about the nature of gangs before trying to intervene with them. And unfortunately, we're not. And the history of the American interventions is that we intervene on the basis of our ideologies, not on the basis of what we understand about the nature of those gangs.
Developing strategies to prevent Vietnamese gangs from becoming new lords of organized crime may take some time. After all, the Mafia flourished virtually untouched for 7 decades in America before law enforcers finally began to win the battle. One thing is very clear. The law will have to find innovative and potent new ways to deal with a new breed of criminal, because the old order
and the ways of fighting it have passed irrevocably into history. I'm Robert Stack. Thanks for joining us.